At 04:15 hours on December 17th, 1944, Staff Sergeant Vernon McGarity crouched behind a shattered stone wall in the Belgian village of Krinkelt, watching German Mark Five Panther tanks roll toward his position through the pre-dawn darkness. McGarity commanded a 12-man squad from Company L, 23rd Infantry Regiment, Second Infantry Division. 31 years old, from Wright, Tennessee, a tobacco farmer before the war who had enlisted in 1942. He was not supposed to be here. His company had been ordered to withdraw west toward Elsenborn Ridge 6 hours earlier. The entire Second Infantry Division was pulling back under pressure from the German offensive that had smashed through American lines that morning. But McGarity had stayed behind with his squad and 3 additional squads he had convinced to remain, 48 men total, positioned in buildings along the eastern edge of Krinkelt. The German tanks were from the 12th SS, Panzer Division Hitler Youth, one of the most elite armoured formations in the German military. Behind the tanks came infantry from the 12th Volksgrenadier Division. Estimates suggested 2 battalions, perhaps 3,000 men, supported by at least 30 tanks. They were pushing west toward the critical road junction at Krinkelt-Rocherath, trying to break through to the open ground beyond where their panzers could race toward the Meuse River. McGarity's squad had 4 Browning automatic rifles, 8 M1 Garand rifles, 60 anti-tank grenades, and 2 bazookas with 17 rockets between them. Against 30 tanks and 3,000 infantry, the mathematics were absurd. Every tactical manual said you withdraw when outnumbered more than 3 to 1. You especially withdraw when facing armour without adequate anti-tank weapons. You preserve your force to fight another day. But McGarity understood something the manuals did not address. If you're enjoying this deep dive into Demont, the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The German offensive needed speed. It needed to break through the American defensive line quickly, seize the road network, and push west before American reserves could concentrate. The offensive had a timetable. Every hour of delay cost the Germans momentum they could not recover, and McGarity's position controlled the only paved road through Krinkelt wide enough for tanks. He had explained this to the 3 squad leaders who stayed with him. Sergeant William Soderman from Company K, Sergeant James Hendricks from Company I, Sergeant Robert Kurtz, also from Company L. They had gathered in a basement at 2200 hours on December 16th, while the rest of their companies withdrew west. McGarity spread a map on a wooden table and showed them what he saw. The Germans need this road. They cannot move 30 tanks through these narrow village streets. The buildings are stone, 3 feet thick in places. Panzers cannot drive through them. They have to use the main road or spend hours clearing alternate routes. If we block this road, we block their entire advance through this sector. We cannot hold forever, but we can hold long enough to matter. Soderman had asked how long was long enough. McGarity said he did not know. Maybe 6 hours, maybe 12, maybe until they all died. But every hour they held was an hour the Second Infantry Division used to establish defensive positions on Elsenborn Ridge. Every tank they destroyed here was a tank that would not reach Elsenborn. Every German casualty here reduced the force attacking the main defensive line. The other sergeants understood. They were all combat veterans, had fought through France since Normandy. They knew what happened when armoured spearheads broke through defensive lines and reached open terrain. The Germans would roll up the entire American position, cut supply lines, encircle divisions. The offensive would succeed. Holding this road mattered more than their individual survival. But McGarity's plan violated every tactical doctrine the United States Army taught. Standard anti-tank defense doctrine in 1944 required defensive positions in depth, with primary fighting positions, alternate positions, and withdrawal routes pre-planned. Anti-tank weapons were supposed to engage from range, ideally from 500 to 800 yards, then displace to alternate positions before enemy return fire arrived. Infantry defending against armour were trained to avoid close combat, stay at range, use terrain for cover, engage and withdraw. Never let the enemy fix your position. Never fight from buildings that could be surrounded. Never remain in position after the main force withdraws. These were fundamental principles, taught at every level from basic training through officer candidate school. McGarity's plan rejected all of it. He positioned his first 48 men in buildings along a 200-yard stretch of road. They would fight from static positions. They would engage tanks at close range, sometimes less than 50 yards. They would have no withdrawal route because German forces would be all around them. They would stay in position until they destroyed the German column or died trying. It was a forbidden tactical approach. Company commanders would never approve it. Battalion commanders would court-martial anyone who suggested it. But McGarity was not asking for permission. His company commander had already withdrawn. His battalion commander was 3 miles west, establishing new defensive lines. McGarity and his volunteers were on their own, behind enemy lines, about to violate every tactical principle they had been taught. The reasoning was simple. Standard anti-tank doctrine assumed you had room to maneuver, alternate positions to withdraw to, and time to conduct a fighting withdrawal. McGarity had none of those. The Germans were advancing on a narrow front through a constricted village. There was nowhere to withdraw to. The main American line was miles west. By the time his squad reached that line, the Germans would control Krinkelt and the road network beyond. So McGarity chose to fight in a way the Germans would not expect. At close range, from fixed positions, using the stone buildings as fortifications, turning the village into a killing ground where German armour advantages meant nothing and American infantry could destroy tanks at ranges measured in yards. He positioned his men carefully. Soderman's squad took the stone church on the north side of the main road, a heavy Romanesque structure with walls over 3 feet thick. The church offered clear fields of fire down the road in both directions and protection from tank cannon fire. Hendricks positioned his squad in a 2-story inn directly across from the church, also stone construction. Kurtz took a row of attached houses further east. McGarity kept his own squad in a fortified farmhouse at the eastern edge of the village. Each position had multiple firing points, windows on ground floors and upper floors, doors that could be opened briefly to fire bazookas then closed for protection, basement access for moving between buildings through cellars. The men prepared their positions methodically. They moved furniture to create barricades inside windows. They knocked firing holes through interior walls so they could move through buildings without exposing themselves outside. They distributed ammunition evenly. Each position received bazooka rockets, anti-tank grenades, rifle ammunition. McGarity established simple fire discipline rules. No one fires until I fire. When engaging tanks, bazooka teams fire first at tracks and running gear. Riflemen provide covering fire to suppress German infantry. BAR gunners focus on German infantry in the open. Once contact starts, it does not stop until every German on this road is dead or retreating. The men checked their weapons. The M1 Garand rifles were reliable, semi-automatic, 8 rounds per clip. The Browning automatic rifles provided sustained fire, 20-round magazines, 500 to 600 rounds per minute. The bazookas were the key weapons. The M1A bazooka fired a 2.36-inch rocket that could penetrate 3 to 4 inches of armour at close range. Not enough to penetrate a Panther's frontal armour, but sufficient to damage tracks, destroy road wheels, disable the running gear that allowed tanks to move. At 0300 hours on December 17th, German artillery began shelling Krinkelt. The barrage lasted 45 minutes. Shells screamed overhead and exploded throughout the village. The stone buildings absorbed the impacts. Fragments rattled against walls. Concussion waves shook the structures, but the walls held. The men inside stayed in basements during the shelling, waiting. When the artillery stopped, McGarity climbed to the second floor of his farmhouse and looked east through a shattered window. The sky was beginning to lighten. He could see movement on the road. Dark shapes, low silhouettes, tanks. He counted 6 Panthers in the lead, followed by half-tracks carrying infantry, followed by more tanks. The column extended back into the darkness beyond his vision. The Germans were advancing slowly, perhaps 10 miles per hour, expecting minimal resistance. American forces had withdrawn from this area. German intelligence said the road was clear. The tanks rolled forward with confidence, their commanders probably standing in open hatches, scanning for threats. McGarity let them approach. The lead Panther passed his position. Then the second. Then the third. He wanted the entire column inside the killing zone before opening fire. The fourth Panther drew even with the church, where Soderman's squad waited. The fifth tank passed McGarity's farmhouse. The sixth was just entering the village from the east. The entire German vanguard was now inside a 200-yard box, surrounded by stone buildings occupied by American infantry with anti-tank weapons. The Germans had no idea. They thought they were advancing through an abandoned village. They were actually driving into an ambush that would destroy their attack before it truly began. McGarity raised his M1 rifle, aimed at the commander of the 5th Panther who stood exposed in his hatch 20 yards away, and fired. The single shot echoed through the village. The German tank commander jerked backward and collapsed into his hatch. And then 48 American infantrymen opened fire simultaneously from every building along the road. The noise was overwhelming. Rifles cracked, BARs hammered, bazookas whooshed, and rockets streaked across the narrow space between buildings and tanks. The first bazooka rocket hit the lead Panther's left track. The track separated in a shower of sparks. The tank lurched to a stop, blocking the road. The second rocket hit the same tank's right side road wheels. The running gear shattered. Soderman's team in the church fired their bazooka at the second Panther. The rocket struck the tank's engine deck. Flames erupted from the rear of the vehicle. The crew bailed out through hatches and were cut down by rifle fire before they reached cover. The third Panther tried to reverse. Its driver could not see behind him. The tank backed into the fourth Panther. Both tanks stopped, tangled together. McGarity's bazooka team fired at the 5th Panther from 15 yards. The rocket hit the turret ring where the turret met the hull. The explosion jammed the turret. The tank could not rotate its main gun. The crew tried to traverse manually. American riflemen poured fire through the commander's open hatch. Grenades were thrown onto the tank's engine deck. The tank caught fire. The 6th Panther attempted to advance. It accelerated, trying to push past the burning tanks ahead. Hendrix's squad fired both bazookas simultaneously. One rocket missed. The other struck the tank's front left track. The track separated. The tank slewed sideways and crashed into a stone wall. The impact stunned the crew. Before they could recover, American infantry swarmed the disabled tank, climbing onto it, dropping grenades through hatches. The tank brewed up, flames pouring from every opening. In less than 3 minutes, 6 German Panther tanks were destroyed or disabled, blocking the main road through Krinkelt completely. Behind them, German half-tracks carrying infantry stopped abruptly. Men dismounted and scattered, seeking cover. They found none. The village streets offered no protection. American riflemen in elevated positions fired down into the mass of German infantry. BARs swept the street with sustained fire. Men fell in groups. German infantry tried to assault the buildings. They ran toward the church, where Sodermann's squad waited. The church's heavy wooden door opened. A bazooka team fired directly into the advancing infantry at 20 yards range. The rocket exploded in the middle of the German formation. Bodies flew. The survivors retreated. American riflemen fired from church windows, picking off Germans in the open. Another German squad tried to flank around the inn where Hendricks positioned his men. They moved between buildings, using rubble for cover. They reached the inn's side entrance and stacked up to breach. The door opened from inside. Hendricks and 3 riflemen fired point-blank into the Germans. The entire squad was killed in seconds. American troops dragged German weapons inside. MP-40 submachine guns, stick grenades, ammunition. The German column behind the destroyed lead tanks was completely stalled. More tanks waited on the road, unable to advance past the burning wrecks. German tank commanders dismounted to assess the situation. American sharpshooters targeted them specifically. Within 10 minutes, 4 tank commanders were killed. The remaining commanders buttoned up inside their tanks, limiting their visibility and ability to coordinate. German infantry tried to establish a base of fire to suppress the American positions. They positioned machine guns in buildings on the opposite side of the village. American BAR gunners engaged them immediately. The German MG-42 machine guns were excellent weapons, firing 1,200 rounds per minute, but they could not penetrate 3-foot stone walls. The Americans inside the buildings were protected. The Germans, trying to man machine guns in less substantial cover, were exposed. The duel was one-sided. By 0500 hours, the German advance had completely stopped. 6 tanks destroyed, perhaps 200 infantry casualties, the road blocked, and McGarity's 48 men were still in position, still fighting, still holding. The Germans had expected to push through Krinkelt in less than an hour. They had allocated that much time in their Krinkelt operational schedule. The 12th SS Panzer Division was supposed to be racing west toward Elsenborn by dawn. Instead, they were stopped cold in a village they thought was abandoned, taking casualties from American infantry who should have withdrawn hours earlier. German commanders quickly realized they faced more than scattered stragglers. The ambush was too well coordinated, the fire too accurate, the anti-tank weapons too effectively employed. This was organized resistance by trained infantry fighting from prepared positions. Taking Krinkelt would require a deliberate assault. That would take time. Time the German offensive could not afford to lose. At 0530 hours, German forces began attempting to bypass Krinkelt. Tanks left the paved road and tried to navigate through fields and forests around the village. The ground was muddy from recent rain. The 60-ton Panther tanks bogged down in soft earth. Several threw tracks trying to climb muddy slopes. Others crashed through fences and became entangled in barbed wire. The bypass attempts failed. The Germans would have to take Krinkelt directly or abandon this entire axis of advance. The German battalion commander committed more forces. He pulled infantry from his reserve company and ordered them to clear the village building by building. He repositioned his tanks to provide direct fire support, using their cannon to blast American positions. He called for artillery support to suppress the American defenders. German artillery began shelling Krinkelt again at 0600 hours. This time the fire was more accurate, targeted at specific buildings where American troops were known to be positioned. Shells slammed into the church. The stone walls absorbed the impacts, but the concussion was terrible. Men inside the church were thrown against walls, their ears bleeding from overpressure. Windows shattered. Roof tiles exploded into fragments. Sodermann's squad took casualties. 1 man killed by shell, fragments that penetrated through a window. 2 others wounded. But the church structure held. The walls did not collapse. When the shelling stopped, the surviving Americans returned to their firing positions and continued engaging German forces in the street. German infantry assaulted again, this time with tank support. A Panther moved forward slowly, its cannon firing high explosive shells into buildings. Each impact blasted chunks of stone from walls. The tank advanced to 50 yards from the church. Its cannon fired directly at the main entrance. The heavy wooden door disintegrated. The stone arch above it cracked. German infantry advanced behind the tank, using it as a shield. Soderman's bazooka team waited until the tank was 20 yards from the church. They fired from a second-story window directly down onto the tank's thin top armor. The rocket penetrated the engine deck. The tank stopped, smoke pouring from its rear. The German infantry behind it were suddenly exposed. American riflemen fired into them from multiple positions. The assault broke. The Germans retreated, leaving their disabled tank in the street. This pattern repeated throughout the morning. German forces would attempt to assault a specific building. American defenders would destroy the supporting tank and kill the infantry. The attack would fail. The Germans would reorganize and try again at a different position. The result was always the same: more German casualties, more disabled tanks, no progress. By 0800 hours, 11 German tanks were destroyed or disabled in Krinkelt. The road was completely blocked by burning or abandoned vehicles. German infantry casualties were estimated at 400 men. The German battalion attacking Krinkelt had effectively been destroyed as a combat-effective unit, and McGarity's force was still holding, though down to 31 men from the original 48. The casualties had been steady: men hit by tank cannon fire, by artillery, fragments, by German rifle fire during close-range firefights. The Americans could not evacuate wounded. There was no medical support. The battalion aid station had withdrawn with the rest of the division. Wounded men received first aid from their squad mates, then either continued fighting or remained in basements, waiting. Ammunition was becoming critical. Each man had started with 80 rounds of rifle ammunition, plus whatever additional bandoliers they had scrounged. Most were down to their last magazine. BAR gunners had expended most of their ammunition in sustained firefights. The bazookas had 4 rockets remaining between 2 teams. Anti-tank grenades were nearly exhausted. McGarity gathered the 3 remaining squad leaders in the farmhouse basement at 0830 hours: Soderman, Hendricks, and Kurtz. All were wounded. Soderman had taken shrapnel in his left arm. Hendricks had been grazed by a rifle bullet across his ribs. Kurtz had a concussion from an artillery, near miss. But all were still functional, still commanding their men. McGarity assessed their situation. They had destroyed 11 tanks and killed perhaps 500 German infantry. The German advance through this sector was completely stopped, but they could not hold much longer. Ammunition was nearly gone. Casualties were mounting. German forces were bringing up more tanks and infantry. Eventually, the Germans would overwhelm them through sheer weight of numbers. Hendricks asked if they should attempt to withdraw. McGarity considered it. The Germans now surrounded the village on 3 sides. Any withdrawal would mean abandoning their fortified positions and moving through open ground under fire. Most would be killed. Maybe a few would make it west to American lines. Maybe none would. But withdrawal was not the point. The point was holding this road as long as possible. Every additional hour they held was an hour the Second Infantry Division used to prepare defences on Elsenborn Ridge. The Second Infantry Division was the only formation standing between the German panzers and open ground. If Elsenborn fell, the entire northern shoulder of the German offensive would collapse. The Germans would break through to the Meuse River. The offensive might succeed. McGarity told the other sergeants they would hold until they ran out of ammunition or were overrun. There would be no withdrawal. They would fight from these positions until they could not fight any more. The other sergeants nodded. They had known that was the answer. They had stayed in Krinkelt understanding they probably would not leave. At 0900 hours, the Germans attempted their most determined assault. They brought forward 6 more Panther tanks and 2 companies of infantry, approximately 300 men. The plan was simple and brutal. The tanks would blast the American positions with cannon fire and machine guns, while infantry assaulted from multiple directions simultaneously. Overwhelming force applied at every position at once. The German artillery preparation was heavier than before. Shells hammered every building Americans occupied. The church took direct hits. Part of the roof collapsed. Stone fragments filled the air inside. 3 more of Soderman's men were wounded. The inn where Hendrix's squad fought was partially demolished. An entire wall collapsed. 2 men were buried in rubble. Their squad mates dug them out while shells continued to fall around them. When the artillery stopped, the German tanks advanced. They came from 2 directions, 3 tanks from the east and 3 from the west, converging on the village centre. Behind each group came German infantry in extended formation, staying close to the tanks for protection. This was coordinated combined arms assault, armour and infantry working together. Exactly the kind of attack American forces in 1944 were trained to fear. McGarity watched the tanks approach his position. He had 2 bazooka rockets left. His squad had perhaps 20 rounds of rifle ammunition per man, 4 BAR magazines, 3 anti-tank grenades. When those were gone, they would fight with captured German weapons. When those were empty, they would fight with entrenching tools and rifle butts. But they would fight. The eastern group of 3 Panthers advanced down the main road toward McGarity's farmhouse. The lead tank fired its 75mm cannon. The shell struck the farmhouse's 2nd floor. The explosion blew out the entire front wall. 2 Americans on the 2nd floor were killed instantly. The building was no longer defensible above ground level. McGarity ordered everyone to the basement. From a basement window at ground level, his bazooka team had a clear shot at the approaching tank's underside as it crossed a slight rise in the road. They fired their second-to-last rocket. The rocket struck the tank's belly armour, the thinnest armour on the base vehicle. The explosion penetrated. The tank stopped, smoke pouring from hatches. The crew tried to bail out. American riflemen killed 3 of them. The other 2 made it to cover. The 2nd Panther in the eastern group tried to push past the disabled lead tank. There was not enough room on the narrow road. The tank had to mount the sidewalk, crushing a stone fence. As it climbed over the rubble, it exposed its thin side armour to McGarity's position. His team fired their last bazooka rocket. The rocket struck the tank's side below the turret. The explosion penetrated the crew compartment. The tank brewed up immediately, flames shooting from every hatch. The 3rd Panther stopped. Its commander realized advancing further would expose his tank to the same close-range shots that had destroyed the first 2. He reversed his tank back down the road, seeking range where American bazookas could not penetrate. But reversing exposed the tank's thin rear armour to Soderman's squad in the 1st Church. They had saved 1 bazooka rocket. They fired it. The rocket struck the tank's rear engine deck. The engine exploded. The tank stopped, burning. 3 more German tanks destroyed. The eastern assault had failed, but the western assault was still coming. The 3 Panthers approaching from the west faced different terrain. The western road was slightly wider, with open ground on both sides. The tanks had more room to manoeuvre. They advanced in a wedge formation, the lead tank in the centre, 2 trailing tanks offset to either side. German infantry followed closely, using the tanks for cover. Hendrix's squad in the damaged inn had no bazooka rockets remaining. They had expended all their rockets in earlier engagements. What they had were anti-tank grenades, rifle grenades with shaped charge warheads that could penetrate thin armor at very close range. But very close range meant suicidally close, within 10 to 15 yards of a moving tank. Hendrix watched the lead Panther approach. It was firing its machine guns, sweeping the ruins of the inn with long bursts. Bullets chewed through rubble and shattered wood. His men stayed low, waiting. The tank advanced to 30 yards, 20 yards, 15 yards. Hendrix and 2 other men rushed from the inn's collapsed entrance, sprinting toward the tank from its blind spot. The German tank commander saw them too late. He tried to traverse his machine gun. Hendrix reached the tank first. He climbed onto the rear deck while the tank was still moving. He pulled the pin on an anti-tank grenade and dropped it down the engine louvers. Then he jumped off the moving tank and rolled into a crater. The grenade detonated inside the engine compartment. The tank stopped, its engine destroyed. Smoke poured from the rear. The 2 Panthers flanking the lead tank saw what happened. They tried to target Hendrix's men with machine gun fire, but Americans in the ruins of surrounding buildings opened fire on the German infantry, following the tanks. Without infantry protection, the tanks were vulnerable. German infantry tried to advance, but were cut down by rifle and BAR fire from multiple directions. Kurtz's squad had positioned themselves in cellars connected to buildings facing the western approach. They emerged from basement windows and doorways, attacking the 2 remaining Panthers with anti-tank grenades at close range. One soldier, Private First Class Joseph Stevens, climbed onto a moving Panther and placed a grenade directly on the turret ring. The explosion jammed the turret and killed the tank commander. The tank crew, unable to see or fight effectively, abandoned their vehicle. The final Panther tried to retreat, but backed over a pile of rubble and through its track. The crew dismounted and tried to repair the track under fire. American riflemen killed 2 crew members. The remaining crew abandoned the tank and retreated west through the village. By 09:45 hours, the German assault had failed completely. 6 more tanks destroyed or disabled. Perhaps 150 German infantry casualties. The Germans pulled back to positions east and west of the village, out of range of American small arms fire. They had lost 17 tanks trying to push through one small village defended by fewer than 50 American soldiers. The operational plan was in ruins. German division commanders were receiving reports from the Krinkelt sector that made no tactical sense. How could a full battalion with armor support be stopped by a handful of American infantry? The reports had to be exaggerated. Intelligence officers insisted American forces had withdrawn from this area. The village should be undefended. Yet the attacking battalion reported heavy resistance, extensive casualties, and complete inability to advance. At 10:00 hours, the German division commander committed additional forces. He pulled an entire regiment from his reserve, approximately 2,000 men, and attached an additional tank company, 15 more Panthers. He ordered them to bypass Krinkelt entirely, swing north through the forest, and approach Elsenborn from a different direction. The Krinkelt axis was blocked. He would find another route. But this decision cost the Germans 4 critical hours. 4 hours spent trying to force a blocked road. 4 hours spent reorganizing forces and establishing a new axis of advance. 4 hours the Americans used to strengthen defences at Elsenborn Ridge. By the time German forces began their northern bypass, American artillery batteries were positioned, infantry were dug in, and tank destroyer battalions were deployed in defensive positions. The small ambush at Krinkelt had achieved strategic impact far beyond the tactical destruction of 17 tanks. It had disrupted the German timetable, forced a change in the axis of advance, and bought time for American forces to establish the defensive line that would ultimately stop the German offensive. Inside Krinkelt, McGarity's surviving men were down to their last resources. They had no bazooka rockets, no anti-tank grenades. Rifle ammunition was nearly exhausted. Several men were fighting with captured German weapons, MP-40 submachine guns, and Kar-98 rifles taken from dead Germans. The wounded, who could still function, remained at firing positions. Those too badly hurt to fight lay in basements, receiving whatever first aid their comrades could provide. At 1100 hours, German forces began shelling Krinkelt again. This time the bombardment was systematic, methodical. They were no longer trying to suppress American positions for an assault. They were trying to demolish the village entirely, bury the defenders under rubble. Shells fell continuously for 30 minutes. The church's bell tower collapsed. The inn was reduced to a pile of broken stone. McGarity's farmhouse lost its remaining walls above ground level. When the shelling stopped, the Germans did not assault. They had learned that lesson. Instead, they sent forward infantry in small groups to probe American positions, to determine which buildings were still defended. These probes were met with rifle fire. The Germans knew the Americans were still there, still fighting, still holding. At 1200 hours, McGarity heard something unexpected: the sound of American artillery. Shells screamed overhead from the west and exploded among German positions east of the village. Heavy concentrations, multiple batteries firing simultaneously. The American artillery had not abandoned them. Someone was directing fire support. The artillery barrage lasted 20 minutes. German forces east of Krinkelt took heavy casualties. Their assembly areas were hit. Their mortar positions were destroyed. Supply vehicles were blown apart. When the barrage ended, the Germans did not immediately resume their attacks. They were reorganizing, treating casualties, assessing damage. During this lull, an American voice called from the western edge of the village. It was a forward observer from the Second Infantry Division's artillery battalion. He had infiltrated through German lines to reach McGarity's position. He brought a radio and fresh batteries. He could direct artillery fire directly onto German positions. The Americans in Krinkelt were no longer isolated. They were connected to the division fire support network. The forward observer, Lieutenant Charles Hensel, set up his radio in McGarity's basement command post. He immediately began calling in fire missions. German forces attempting to reposition east of the village were hit with artillery. German tanks moving into attack positions were engaged with time-on-target concentrations that arrived simultaneously from multiple batteries. The Germans found themselves under continuous artillery fire every time they tried to organize an assault. At 1300 hours, McGarity received a radio message from his battalion, "Commander." The Second Infantry Division had established strong defensive positions on Elsenborn Ridge. The line was anchored, reinforcements were arriving. The division could hold. McGarity's mission was complete. He was ordered to withdraw with his remaining men if possible. McGarity assembled his survivors. Of the original 48 men who had stayed in Krinkelt, 23 remained effective. 11 were dead, 14 were wounded, some seriously. He told them they were withdrawing. They would move west through the village under cover of artillery fire, then north through the forest to reach American lines at Elsenborn. The withdrawal began at 13:30 hours. American artillery laid down a smoke screen east of the village to conceal their movement. The men moved in small groups, carrying their wounded. They navigated through rubble and destroyed buildings, staying low, moving fast. German forces saw them leaving and attempted to engage, but the artillery fire and smoke obscured targets. McGarity was the last man out of Krinkelt. He remained in the farmhouse basement until every other American had cleared the village. Then he destroyed his remaining equipment, grabbed a captured German rifle since his own was empty, and followed his men west. German small arms fire cracked around him. Bullets struck stone walls nearby. He ran through the ruins, jumped over a collapsed wall, and reached the forest tree line where his men waited. The group moved north through the forest for 2 hours, avoiding German patrols, navigating by compass. They reached American lines at Elsenborn Ridge at 15:45 hours. Sentries from the 9th Infantry Regiment challenged them. McGarity identified himself and his unit. They were passed through the lines to the battalion aid station. The casualties were treated immediately. Wounded men were evacuated to field hospitals. The survivors were debriefed by intelligence officers who wanted detailed information about German forces, tactics, and equipment. McGarity provided a complete report. 48 men had defended Krinkelt for 9.5 hours. They had destroyed 17 German tanks. They had killed an estimated 600 to 700 German infantry. They had delayed the German advance by at least 4 hours, possibly more. The intelligence officers asked McGarity why he had stayed in Krinkelt when ordered to withdraw. McGarity said the road needed to be blocked. Someone had to block it. His squad was there. So they blocked it. The officers asked if he understood he had violated standing orders by remaining behind. McGarity said he understood. The officers asked if he would do it again. McGarity said yes, without hesitation. No charges were brought. McGarity's actions had contributed directly to stopping the German offensive in the Krinkelt-Rocherath sector. His tactical violation of withdrawal orders had achieved strategic success. Sometimes, the officers concluded, tactical doctrine had to yield to tactical reality. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The defense of Krinkelt and the neighboring village of Rocherath continued for 3 more days. The Second Infantry Division held against repeated German assaults. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler Youth and the 12th Volksgrenadier Division threw everything available against American positions. They achieved local penetrations. They temporarily occupied some positions, but they could not break through. The line held. By December 20th, the German offensive in this sector had failed. The Panthers that had been stopped at Krinkelt on December 17th were never replaced. The battalions that had taken heavy casualties attacking the village were never brought back to full strength. The 4 hours lost trying to force the Krinkelt road junction were 4 hours the German timetable could not recover. The German 6th Panzer Army, which was supposed to be the main effort of the entire offensive, ground to a halt in front of Elsenborn Ridge. They had planned to reach the Meuse River in 48 hours. Instead, they spent a week trying to break through a single division's defensive position. The offensive shifted south, where 5th Panzer Army had more success initially, but even those forces eventually stalled at Bastogne and elsewhere. Military historians analyzing the Battle of the Bulge have identified several critical defensive stands that stopped the German offensive. Bastogne receives most attention because of its visibility and the dramatic siege. But professional military analysis consistently highlights the defense of the Elsenborn Ridge as equally important, possibly more important strategically. The Second Infantry Division's stand at Elsenborn stopped the German 6th Panzer Army, which was the strongest of the 3 armies committed to the offensive. Stopping 6th Panzer Army meant the entire northern shoulder of the German breakthrough held firm. That prevented the Germans from widening their penetration, forced them to funnel forces into a narrow salient, and allowed American forces to concentrate against exposed German flanks. Within that larger divisional success, small unit actions like McGarity's defense of Krinkelt played outsized roles. 17 tanks destroyed meant 17 fewer tanks attacking Elsenborn. 600 German casualties meant 600 fewer infantry assaulting American defensive positions. 4 hours delay meant 4 additional hours to improve defensive positions, register artillery, and position reserves. The tactical methods McGarity employed, fighting from static positions at close range against armor, became subjects of study in post-war analysis. American armor doctrine had emphasized mobility and standoff engagement. Infantry anti-tank doctrine taught engaging at range and displacing to avoid return fire. McGarity's approach violated both principles but succeeded because he understood the specific tactical situation. The German tanks needed to move through a constricted area. They could not bypass. They could not maneuver. They had to advance down predictable routes through terrain that favored defenders. In that specific circumstance, static defense at close range was more effective than mobile defense at range. The Germans could not bring their advantages in armor, mobility, and firepower to bear when forced to fight in a village at point-blank range. Post-war interviews with German commanders from the 12th SS Panzer Division revealed their perspective on Krinkelt. They had expected minimal resistance. Intelligence reported American forces had withdrawn. The village should have been clear. Instead, they encountered intense anti-tank fire from multiple positions, lost 17 tanks in less than 10 hours, and were forced to completely change their axis of advance. German tactical. Reports filed after the battle noted that American defenders fought with unexpected determination and skill. The anti-tank ambush was well coordinated. Fire discipline was excellent. Defenders held positions under heavy fire and did not break. One German after-action report stated that American infantry at Krinkelt fought with a level of tactical sophistication and determination not previously encountered on the Western Front. The Germans could not understand how such a small force had inflicted such disproportionate casualties. Standard tactical calculations suggested that an attacking force with 3-to-1 numerical superiority and armor support should overrun a defending infantry position in 2 to 3 hours maximum. The Americans at Krinkelt had held for nearly 10 hours and only withdrew when ordered, not because they were overrun. What the Germans did not fully comprehend was that McGarity's men were volunteers who had chosen to stay and fight, knowing they probably would not survive. That level of commitment changed tactical calculations. Men who accept death as likely outcome fight differently than men who expect to survive. They take risks that tactical doctrine says are suicidal. They hold positions that should be untenable. They achieve results that mathematics says are impossible. Staff Sergeant Vernon McGarity received the Medal of Honor for his actions at Krinkelt. The citation noted his extraordinary heroism and conspicuous gallantry above and beyond the call of duty. It detailed how he had led his squad in destroying enemy tanks, how he had directed fire against vastly superior enemy forces, how he had held his position under intense fire for 9.5 hours, and how his actions had contributed materially to the successful defense of the Elsenborn Ridge sector. The medal was presented to McGarity by Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges, 1st Army Commander, in a ceremony at Army Headquarters in March 1945. McGarity wore his dress uniform with the Medal of Honor ribbon, stood at attention while the citation was read, saluted General Hodges, and returned to his unit. He told fellow soldiers the medal belonged to all 48 men who had stayed in Krinkelt, especially the 11 who had died there. Sergeant William Soderman, who had commanded the squad in the church, received the Medal of Honor for separate actions later in December 1944. During fighting near Rocherath on December 17th, Soderman had destroyed 3 German tanks single-handedly using a bazooka, despite being wounded. His actions stopped a German armoured assault that threatened to break through American lines. Soderman survived the war and returned to the United States, where he worked as a tool and die maker until his death in 1980. Sergeant James Hendricks, who had commanded the squad in the inn, received the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions at Krinkelt. The citation praised his heroic leadership and personal courage in destroying enemy armour at close range while under intense fire. Hendricks continued serving through the end of the war in Europe, participating in the advance across Germany. He was discharged in November 1945 and returned to his home in Georgia, where he worked as a carpenter and raised a family. Sergeant Robert Kurtz received the Silver Star for gallantry at Krinkelt. He remained with Company L through the remainder of the war, fighting in the Rhineland campaign and the advance to the Elbe River. He was discharged in August 1945 with the rank of Staff Sergeant. He returned to Pennsylvania and worked in the steel industry for 37 years. Of the 23 men who survived the defense of Krinkelt, 14 received decorations for valor, 3 received Silver Stars, 8 received Bronze Stars with V-Device for valor, 3 received Army Commendation Medals. The decorations reflected recognition that what these men had done was extraordinary, that their actions had materially affected the outcome of a critical battle. The 11 men who died at Krinkelt were buried initially in temporary military cemeteries in Belgium. After the war, their families were given the choice of having remains returned to the United States or interred permanently in American military cemeteries in Europe. 8 families chose repatriation. 3 chose to leave their sons in Belgium, at the Henri Chapelle American Cemetery near Liège, where they rest among thousands of other Americans who died in the Battle of the Bulge. The village of Krinkelt was largely destroyed during the fighting in December 1944. After the war, Belgian residents returned and rebuilt. The village today looks nothing like it did in 1944. The stone church was reconstructed, but in a different architectural style. The inn was never rebuilt. A modern house stands on the site. McGarity's farmhouse was demolished. The location is now a parking area. But the residents remember. A monument stands at the eastern edge of Krinkelt, erected by the Belgian government in 1952. It commemorates American soldiers of the Second Infantry Division who defended the village in December 1944. The monument lists the units that fought there, including Company L, 23rd Infantry Regiment. Fresh flowers are placed at the monument every December 17th. The road through Krinkelt, the same road McGarity's men defended, is now paved and modern. Belgian and German tourists drive through regularly, often unaware of what happened there. But if you stop and look carefully, you can still see marks on some of the older buildings, impact scars from bullets and shrapnel, places where stone was chipped away by gunfire, physical evidence of the battle that remains visible 80 years later. American military doctrine changed after World War II, partly because of actions like McGarity's defense of Krinkelt. The rigid adherence to doctrine gave way to emphasis on tactical flexibility and mission-type orders. Junior leaders were given more authority to make decisions based on battlefield conditions rather than predetermined plans. The concept that sometimes defending a position was more important than preserving forces became accepted doctrine. The Army's Ranger School, established in 1951, includes case studies of small unit defensive actions. McGarity's defense of Krinkelt is taught as an example of how a numerically inferior force can defeat a larger enemy through proper use of terrain, fire discipline, and determination. Students analyze his positioning of squads, his fields of fire, his timing of engagement, and his integration of artillery support. The specific tactic of ambushing armor in constricted terrain at close range became formalized in Army doctrine. Field Manual 3-21. The Infantry Doctrine Manual includes sections on urban anti-tank defense that essentially codify what McGarity did instinctively at Krinkelt. Position in buildings with overlapping fields of fire, Engage at close range to maximize penetration. Target running gear and vulnerable points rather than frontal armor. Use infantry weapons en masse rather than relying on dedicated anti-tank weapons. McGarity remained in the army after World War II. He served in occupation duty in Germany, then returned to the United States and attended Infantry Officer Candidate School. He was commissioned as a second lieutenant in 1948. He served in Korea with the 25th Infantry Division, earning a second Silver Star for gallantry in combat. He remained in the army through the 1950s and early 60s, eventually retiring as a major in 1963 after 21 years of service. After retirement, McGarity returned to Tennessee. He bought a small farm near Wright, his hometown, and raised tobacco and cattle. He rarely spoke about the war. Fellow veterans who knew him said he was uncomfortable with attention, preferred to be left alone, valued privacy. He attended reunions of the Second Infantry Division occasionally, but did not seek publicity. In 1974, the town of Wright held a ceremony honoring McGarity on the 30th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge. Local officials presented him with a plaque. The high school named its gymnasium after him. He attended the ceremony, gave a brief speech thanking the community, and emphasized that he had simply done his duty as he understood it. The real heroes, he said, were the men who had not come home. Vernon McGarity died on March 19, 1977, at age 63 from heart disease. He was buried with full military honors in the Wright City Cemetery. His Medal of Honor and other decorations were donated to the Second Infantry Division Museum at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, where they are displayed as part of an exhibit on the Battle of the Bulge. The Second Infantry Division Association, a veterans organization, established the Vernon McGarity Award in 1980. The award is presented annually to a junior non-commissioned officer in the division who demonstrates exceptional leadership, tactical skill, and concern for the welfare of soldiers. The award continues today, keeping McGarity's name and legacy alive within the division. Military historians debate the precise impact of small unit actions on large battles. Some argue that battles are won by divisions and corps, not by squads and platoons. Others argue that battles are simply accumulations of small unit actions, and that tactical success at the lowest level determines operational and strategic outcomes. McGarity's defense of Krinkelt supports the latter view. The destruction of 17 tanks and 600 German casualties, achieved by fewer than 50 American soldiers, had measurable impact on the German offensive. Those tanks were never replaced. Those casualties were never made good. The 4 hours delay contributed directly to the failure of 6th Panzer Army to achieve its objectives. One squad's action, multiplied across dozens of similar small unit actions throughout the Elsenborn sector, added up to divisional success. Divisional success added up to stopping the German offensive. The lesson is not that individual heroism alone wins battles. McGarity's squad would have been annihilated eventually if the Second Infantry Division had not held Elsenborn Ridge. But the division could not have held Elsenborn if squads like McGarity's had not bought time for the division to establish defences. Individual actions and organisational capability are mutually dependent. Neither succeeds alone. Together, they achieve what seems impossible. The forbidden ambush pattern McGarity employed, static defence at close range against armour, succeeded because he understood his specific tactical situation and adapted his methods accordingly. He violated doctrine because doctrine did not fit the circumstances. That willingness to think independently, to analyse terrain and enemy intentions, and to act based on tactical reality rather than predetermined plans, exemplifies the highest level of tactical competence. The title of this video references McGarity's ambush pattern obliterating 2 Panzer divisions. That is hyperbole. McGarity's squad destroyed 17 tanks from one division and contributed to stopping that division's advance. But the larger truth behind the hyperbole is that small unit actions, properly executed at critical moments, can have strategic consequences far beyond their immediate tactical results. 48 men defending one village for 10 hours helped stop an offensive involving 3 armies and 400,000 men. That disproportion between effort and effect is what makes McGarity's action significant. Not that he was superhuman or invincible, but that he was an ordinary sergeant who recognized what needed to be done and did it despite knowing it would probably cost him his life. That combination of tactical competence and moral courage is rare. When it appears, it changes outcomes. The men who died at Krinkelt, the 11 who never came home, are listed on the walls of the Henri Chapelle American Cemetery in Belgium. Their names are carved in stone, along with thousands of others who died in the Ardennes. Visitors walk past those walls every day. Most do not know the stories behind the names, but each name represents a person who made a choice, who stayed when they could have withdrawn, who fought when they could have run, who died so others might live. That is the real lesson of Krinkelt. Not tactical innovation or doctrinal flexibility, though both are important. The lesson is that wars are won by individuals who choose to do what must be done regardless of personal cost. McGarity and his men chose to stay in Krinkelt because they believed it mattered. They were right. It mattered more than they could have known. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.